guys, Nikki here. I'm here today to do the spoiler review for The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. It's the first book in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, although basically everyone should know that because this is like the standard to which most high fantasy is kind of compared to now. I love fantasy. I love fantasy. And I have for many years. However, my love for fantasy is part of why I was wary of reading this book. It's very time consuming because of how established of a world Tolkien makes. And I'd also heard from some people that Tolkien writes like a linguist and not an author, and that makes his books a trial to get through. And while I understand to some extent with pacing, I'd never really felt like I was just wading through words in his book. I felt like I was on a very detailed journey. Like I felt like I could experience much of what the characters were experiencing because of how detailed oriented he was. After watching a review by a YouTuber I enjoy, Murphy Napier, I think I'm saying the last name right. I'll include a link below for her channel. She's amazing. I highly recommend her. She raved about this book in a few videos, about the series really in a few videos, and based on what she said, I thought it sounded good and I decided to take up the gauntlet of the trilogy. And boy was I blown away. I loved the beginning of this trilogy. This is the first kind of 2-book compilation for it. And I loved following the hobbits as they left the Shire, the collection of characters that became the Fellowship of the Ring, and the beginning of their trials as they move forward to defeat the great evil of the world, who has kind of made himself very, very hard to defeat. And I loved the setup and the premise, and having watched the movies, it was nice to have a little bit of an idea of how the characters would look because it made the experience a lot more enjoyable in my mind as I was picturing everything moving forward. I will now move on to my likes and dislikes. I didn't stick to my typical 3 and 3. There's a lot of things I wanted to talk about, so the lists are a little bit longer. So for my likes, I liked the world building. I thought it was effective, detailed, and well-paced, so I never got more information than was necessary, and new information was constantly being given to me, which fleshed the world out very well. I loved the characters. They were loyal, they were friendly, they had intriguing relationships, and just especially the loyalty was just heartwarming and endearing, and I loved to see it through the group and through all the friendships that existed there. I loved the pacing. I loved the pacing at which I got the info, which kind of relates back to the world building. I never felt like any of the exposition was just information dumped over my head about the story or about the world, and I really appreciate that because I hate when I get that much information at once. I usually have to put down the book and kind of figure out how to absorb the information to benefit my experience the most when reading. My fourth like was the atmosphere. I talked about it before, the idea that this is the low point in high fantasy and that there was a higher fantasy world before this. And I love how effectively it's talked about with the runes and the experiences and the history that are told and how far back it goes. And that is really emphasized when you meet like Tom Bombadil and how long his history is and how long the history of their world is and how it's explained by him. My fifth positive for this book is the descriptions, and while I understand that people find them very wordy, I definitely agree. I find them very eloquent and very effective. He does a very good job of describing down to the minute detail to really flesh out the scene and the world around him, and I found that really interesting because it really allowed the world to develop in my mind. And then my sixth like for it was the use of bearers of burdens, and that it was bearers of burdens, a bunch of different burdens, and they all kind of related to and resulted in a desire for the same kind of end goal, or different end goals but for the same reasons, sort of. And that being said, I'm done with my likes. I'll move on to my dislikes. My dislikes was the plot pacing. It was slow, and while it does kind of, I forget, lack of a better term, it mirrors the pace of the adventure of the characters themselves. At times it was very slow, and especially at the very beginning of the book before they even leave the Shire, I found the slowness of the story a little bit hard to get into. But having seen the movies, I knew there was something around the corner, and as I kept reading and I got to that point where you reached the corner and the story turned sideways and became your adventure story, I was excited for it, and I'm glad I stuck through and because it really paid off. It was a brilliant experience. Another dislike was the Dark Rider description. I mentioned it in my spoiler-free one. The way they're described, they sound harmful and creepy, but they don't really have that same kind of scary mysticism and violence necessarily around them. I don't know how to explain it other than to kind of draw a comparison to how I felt about Voldemort and some of his followers. Like, you knew they were the big bad and that they had evil powers of some kind, but at least the first few interactions with them, you didn't really understand kind of what the hype was about. I know that this kind of gets expanded upon as they get closer, as everything starts to wrap up. But in this first book, I didn't feel like the threat level was necessarily where you would think it would be. My third dislike was the lack of urgency, despite the amount of urgency that is talked about. And I think part of it is just they can only move as fast as their feet can carry them. They can only move as fast as their horses can carry them. And I think that's part of where the lack of urgency was, and just like the lack of modern amenities that we used to create urgency weren't there. So the urgency was muted because the technology for it just didn't allow for greater speed to go with the urgency. But it was really weird reading about, oh, these big terrible things are happening, we have to hurry, and then it's still taking like 4 months to do something. And then my final negative is the lack of detail about when and why Gimli and Legolas became friends. Because it's just kind of mentioned, oh yeah, they're friends now. And I need some details, people. The characters all seem kind of surprised by it. I would love more detail as to why they decided they were friends. I just wish I got more details about like the pivotal moment where they realized they were friends. That's what I would like to see. And that being said, I am done with my likes and dislikes for this book, and I will move on to the characters. So I'm not going to list out the characters and talk about them individually because that would take forever, because I have a bajillion things to say about all of them because I love them so much. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to talk a little bit more generally about them. So the big thing being that their friendships and just the staunch loyalty that you get in the group and in the friendships themselves is just amazing, and I love it. I also really enjoyed the fact that the characters were varied, both in how they think in their species and how they look within each species, and how their personalities really came out to play in the interactions. And while the personalities aren't completely fully developed, I know that's really going to kind of take off with the following books, and that they're going to develop as the world develops as well, and as the situation develops around them. I really liked that they also acknowledged the different types of courage and knowledge that were in each character. You look at the type of courage with Frodo being the ring bearer, but then you also have to look at the different types of courage that you get with Merry and Pippin and Sam, who are following him because they're staunchly loyal to this good friend of theirs, and how the different types of knowledge of each of the characters, Gandalf, Aragorn, Gimli, how it plays from everybody to create the situations that they have moving forward, and how they use all of their skills. And I just really like that they're lean on each other's strengths and weaknesses. I also really liked the idea that the story is filled with these bearers of burdens. And I love that because of this, it allows for flawed characters with moments of heroism and these ideas of guilt and courage that walk back and forth between the characters' minds when you get to see into their thoughts a little bit. You have different kinds of burdens. You have Frodo with the burden of the ring. You have Gandalf with the burden of Frodo and setting him on this trail, knowing how dangerous it is. You have the burden of Sam with Frodo and how Sam feels beholden to Frodo for being such a good friend to him, but Sam feeling this burden of having to go along with him because he is so staunchly loyal to his friend and he wants to do anything he can to help him succeed. And you also have the burden of Aragorn and his lineage, and knowing that part of the reason they are where they are today is because an ancestor of his failed to act with appropriate courage and wisdom. And I loved Boromir and the burden of his people and trying to save the lives that he is protecting. And like I said, it made for these beautiful, flawed characters that had moments of heroism, but it still allowed them to feel severe guilt over their actions and then overcome them with moments of courage. And I really like that because the courage happened in many different ways and the guilt was for so many different reasons. And I'm really excited to see how all of these characters fill out as the story progresses and move forward and develop. And that being said, I will wrap it up here. I found that this was a very enjoyable book. It had good pacing with world building, even though the plot was a little bit slow. You just had a collection of lovely characters with interesting relationships and staunchly loyal characteristics, which were amazing. You had these eloquent, well-written descriptions that really fleshed out the world in terms of the aesthetic, and I'm really just excited to continue because it was very clearly the beginnings of just an epic adventure that you want to be part of. So that being said, The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien, I will give 4 out of 5 stars. I highly recommend it to someone who has a lot of time on their hands because it is a very, very robust book, but I highly recommend it because you will enjoy the adventure that you go on. And that is all I have to say about this. I will see you guys in the next video, which will hopefully be the movie review for this book. Bye! Hey guys, it's Nikki here. I'm here today just to do my quick announcement for my book of the month for May. It is No Time for Goodbye by Linwood Barclay. If you missed it, feel free to tune in. I did do a quick unwrapping video for this just to do my announcement for it. It's a thriller. It's about this girl's family who disappears and she never finds out why they leave or what happens, and 25 years later she gets a note that starts to explain it, and it sounds like she kind of goes down the rabbit hole to figure out what happened to her family. I enjoy thrillers, so I anticipate enjoying this. I will see you guys at the end of the month for the review. See ya!